Hi class, we are moving on to the next unit, which is going to be evolution. We are going to look at the theory of evolution. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the difference between a scientific theory and a scientific law. So they're both based on kind of observational data as well as kind of both describing why something happens. Scientific theory are not just an educated guess. There's a large amount of evidence that supports that theory. The difference between the theory and the law is the law you can actually do in an experiment and see the results happen time and time again, where theory you can't. Okay, so other theories other than the evolution would be about gravity, the atomic theory, the Big Bang theory. So they're all there because we can't recreate that to see if it actually would happen time and time again, like your scientific law. If you think of a lot of your chemistry ones or your physics ones, you're able to recreate those time and again. Law of conservation of mass, your gas laws, things like that. So when we're talking about the theory of evolution, the idea to evolve is that you're changing over time. So you're evolving for your specific environment. Okay. And so the idea is that species are constantly having new adaptations, new genes that are happening all the time. And then you'll see them over generation after generation. And so that's the idea of evolution. When you kind of what you need for evolution to occur is you need variation or adaptation. So you have to have species that are genetically different. Then you need also something called selective pressure. And we're going to go through those in the slides as we go. On this slide, you'll see that there is some genetic variation. You have your different colored butterflies. When we're looking at selective pressure on this slide, and we'll go into it more detail as we go on. Using antibiotics to wipe out the weaker bacteria is a selective pressure for the bacteria that are going to be antibiotic resistant. And then the two different color bacteria here, you can see the ones that aren't antibiotic resistant versus the ones that are. That's your variation. So your variation adaptation, it allows for the population's survival for the environment. So if one species isn't part of a species isn't really equipped for that environment, somebody else in that population would be, because they have the adaptation. It's not like an adaptation just pops in one generation. It happens over a long period of time, usually naturally. And how variation and adaptations occur is due to a change in the genetic information. Usually caused through, you'll see through meiosis, mutations. Mutations can be from chromosomes kind of crossing over improperly, kind of what we learned about in genetics. More often, it's going to be through errors in your DNA replication, and you'll see it in generations. There are different types of adaptations. So there's 3 types of adaptations: structural, behavioral, physiological. Structural is actually how you look. So when you have species that can blend into their environment, that's a structural. Mimicry, where you have species that will look like other species as well. That's an example of your structural adaptation. Behavioral is going to be how it acts. If you've ever seen like the BBC birds mating dance, that's an example of behavioral, where it's trying to do the best dance possible and hopefully have a mate. Or in the same video, it has birds that clean their specific area, hoping that a mate will want to come in and like their nice clean area. The physiological one is based on the chemical reactions that happen in the body and the metabolism. So your toxins, your venom, different things like that. How adaptations actually occur are through mutations. So they're that change that we talked about back in your genetics unit, in that genetic information that causes new genes to arise. And based on what happens, remember we said there's silent mutations, harmful and beneficial mutations. And so based on what the mutation is, sometimes it has the potential to influence your future generations because it's inherited from the parent generation. So those three types of mutations, your neutral, harmful, beneficial. Neutral doesn't change anything. Harmful is going to usually reduce the species success of having an organism. So if there's a harmful mutation, it usually doesn't move from generation to generation because they're not reproducing. Beneficial mutations are the ones that you're going to see the most of, because now all of a sudden that specific population that's got that beneficial mutation is now better adapted for the environment that they live in. So now we went through all the adaptations that are caused by your genetic mutation. Now we're going to look at your selective pressure. So this is kind of your form of what you're seeing as natural selection. And that's going to be a factor that makes a population better suited to survive that environment because of that specific selective pressure is not necessarily acting on it. It's more acting on kind of the other species. But so if we look at this picture here, you have your variations where your different colored rabbits. If you notice, you kind of have like the sand color background. So the gray ones and the darker brown ones are going to be picked off faster for food. So then the lighter, more tan colored bunnies are going to survive better. And so the selective pressure on the rabbits causes the tan kind of colored bunnies to survive better in that given situation. If the environment had changed to be more of a kind of rocky gray ones, then the gray ones would. So it totally depends on the specific environment. And then kind of this one's showing your variation, natural selection, selective pressure gives you your new generations, and that's going to be your evolution. A kind of well-known example of and well-studied examples of evolution happened about in the mid 1800s to the late 1800s when the Industrial Revolution happened in England. And so originally these English peppered moths were going to be primarily white. Why that was, if you look at the tree in the picture, you can see the tree has more of that kind of lighter look. And so birds could come in and they would pick off the darker colored moss, so the whiter ones would survive and have a higher rate. But due to genetic variation, you would still see the odd dark one pop up, and sometimes there was an intermediate color as well. Industrial Revolution came in, pollution, those trees darkened. And in doing so, now the light colored moss were easier to pick off. And so then all of a sudden they saw a rapid incline of the dark colored peppered moss because they were easier to blend in with the tree. And so that's an example of a structural adaptation as well as a selective pressure or your natural selection happening on your peppered moss. There is such thing as artificial selection, and this is where you will have usually humans are coming in and choosing specific traits that they want to see bred from generation to generation. So when you're doing like fruit or vegetables, the healthiest looking fruit or the bigger plant they usually want to breed, or the cow that produces the best meat, or the dogs that produce a specific trait. And so you're artificially selecting and you're only breeding the two that you want, that two kind of the two parents that you like the traits from, hoping to get an offspring that shares a similar trait. When doing this, however, you are causing a decrease in the genetic variability. And so you're going to start to see less genetic difference within that population. And so that population can decline if there was, say, a virus, a fungus, or a bacteria that could come in. When we kind of a great example of artificial selections is all the different breeds of dogs. They are all the same species, but you can get a dog with pretty much any trait that you can think of. You can have ones that are now shorter, and you have the larger ones. You can have the kind of the pug nose. And so just depending on the traits. Um, I'll use my dog as an example. I have a Jug. That breed of dog hasn't really existed until kind of just recently, and it's a Jack Russell Pug cross, and that traits that he has is only due to artificial selection and breeding process. So we talked about some limits that you can reduce genetic variability. You also can't produce traits that didn't already exist. So the example of your blue roses don't exist unless you're putting them in food dye, and that doesn't actually count. So you can't create something that's not there. And then there is the possibility of a harmful mutation that can pop up, or a new mutation that we didn't already know about.